Welcome to our discussion on grants and new federalism. These are the topics. What are grants? What is new federalism? What is the devolution revolution? And how have grants been used within the federal structure? So let's get started with what grants are. Federal grants can also be referred to as grants in aid, are allocations or appropriations of money to states from the national government for certain purposes. So the central government of the United States has grown for a variety of reasons in a variety of ways. Most commonly, the national government uses its power of the purse to apply sticks and carrots to state and local governments. So the grants act as the carrots. Grants are appropriations of money given to states by the national government for certain purposes. And we're going to learn about two different types of grants: block grants and categorical grants. Perhaps one of the major first examples of a grant is the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862. It gave each state 30,000 acres of public land for each representative in Congress, and the states could then sell that land and then earmark the money for mechanical and agricultural colleges. And some major schools around the country were set up under the Morrill Land Grant Act, like Texas A&M, the University of Georgia, and Mississippi State University. Grants had been happening before that. There were grants that the national government gave states to pay off debts for the Revolutionary War, but by the 1950s and 1960s, the federal grant program was very well entrenched. It was well established. So FDR sent money to the states for a variety of public works programs. World War II brought more federal money, and these programs made the national government a major player in the local economy and in local policy. Okay, so here's the first type of grant, a federal grant, called a categorical grant. Grants for which Congress appropriates or gives money for a specific purpose. It usually involves a precise formula and is subject to detailed conditions imposed by the national government. So by the 1960s, the federal government saw this type of grant, this categorical grant, as a way to force states to behave in a specific way, in a desired way. So for example, in the 1960s, there was a lot of concern about the poor and minorities. Some states, especially southern states, were blamed for perpetuating discrimination. Some in the national government saw categorical grants as a way to force states to behave in certain ways. So the national government can withhold funding to states if they did not comply, for example. So one example is LBJ's Great Society in 1964. This had a huge impact on grants. There were grants for urban renewal, for education, for poverty programs, Head Start. For Head Start programs and for job training. So the congressional use of funds was seen as a way to bypass conservative state governments and mayors and councils. So increased grants given to states that focus on the need of a national government rather than local issues. So categorical grants are often described as a component of cooperative federalism. So this brings us into a new era of federalism. Sorry, I think I just said that. Got ahead of myself. New federalism. This was a federal-state relationship proposed by Ronald Reagan's administration during the 1980s. So this roughly lasts from 1980 to 2001. And the hallmark of new federalism is returning power to the states. This is the Reagan Revolution. Reagan argued that grants and aid, and specifically categorical grants, were imposing national priorities on the states. Liberals at the time were arguing that grants and aid, these categorical grants, were an effective way to raise the level of services provided to the poor and others. But Reagan argued otherwise. because he felt like it was hard for states to resist the lure of grants. So Reagan favored block grants. And block grants are broad grants with few strings attached, given to states by the federal government for specific activities, but the categories aren't as restrictive. They might be for secondary education or health services, or education, health, income security, and transportation. So that gave the states a lot of discretion in how to spend that money. There wasn't such a formula or a precise mechanism for spending the money as in categorical grants. Block grants were much more open to state needs and to what the state wanted to do with the money. The states had a lot of discretion. So many state governors like this. They saw new federalism as a return to the idea of states being a laboratory for democracy, where states get to experiment with laws that might work for that state and see if it's something that works well in one state, if it can be transferred to other states, instead of having the national government impose their opinion. Next up is the devolution revolution, which continues this idea of new federalism under Bill Clinton's administration, starting in 1992. In 1994, Bill Clinton was faced with a Republican-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate, and they instituted and continued with block grants. Block grants proved to be very popular in the states as a laboratory for democracy again. This idea of devolution is returning power to the states, returning national power back to the states. And it's a very strong and popular idea among conservatives. And Newt Gingrich's contract with America, Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House in 1994, and he was swept into office in 1994 on this pledge to debate the role of the national government, which was his contract with America. And it proved to be very popular and effective for Newt Gingrich for a few years. And he worked his leadership in the House and in the Senate, with Republicans in the Senate, worked with Bill Clinton to continue the devolution revolution. So here's an example of how this devolution comes into play. The Unfunded Mandate Reform Act of 1995. So here's what unfunded mandates are. Unfunded mandates are national laws that direct state and local governments to comply with federal rules, like clean air and water standards, but contain no federal funding to defray the cost of meeting these requirements. So it's telling states to meet a standard that costs money to meet, but not providing the funding for the states to meet that standard. So it forces states to come up with their own funding. But under the Unfunded Mandate Reform Act of 1995, debate had to be given to funding before it was passed as a mandate. And then here's another example of devolution that happened under Clinton's administration at the same time that Newt Gingrich had his contract with America. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, commonly called welfare reform, returned much of the control over welfare back to the states. And then that brings us into the presidency of George W. Bush, who, as a conservative, campaigned to reduce the size of national government. That's typically a rallying cry for conservatives. But he was faced with some extraordinary circumstances. 9/11 and a struggling economy forced him to act. He used emergency funds from the national government to help states with budget shortfalls, which is not really returning power to the states. That's still using the national government. And with 9/11, there's also an expansion of national power. George W. Bush added a new department to his cabinet, Department of Homeland Security. He also passed No Child Left Behind. A lot of conservatives say that education is a local issue, best left to the states and the counties. But No Child Left Behind was a huge increase in the role of the national federal government into education. And this is an example of preemption, which is a concept derived from the Constitution's Supremacy Clause that allows the national government to override or preempt state or local actions in certain areas, in this case, education. Up until this point, preemption was mostly favored by Democrats like LBJ. But Congress uses its authority under the Commerce Clause to preempt state law. So George W. Bush was responsible for a few pieces of legislation that wouldn't seem conservative at first glance. So almost a halting of new federalism and the devolution revolution. But the Supreme Court at the same time could be returning power to the states. As we mentioned before, the Supreme Court always plays a huge role in determining the parameters of federalism, the relationship between the national and state governments. Up until the 1980s, the court's role was mostly to expand federal power, but starting in the 1980s, the court began to limit Congress's ability to regulate in a variety of areas. Ronald Reagan and later Bush appointed justices who were more devoted to states' rights. So here's a few examples of some major court cases that returned power to the states at the expense of the national government. Webster versus Reproductive Health Services in 1989, it made the decision that states can place restrictions on abortion. It still upheld Roe versus Wade, that women have the right to an abortion, but it allowed, this court case, Webster, allowed states to start placing restrictions on the abortion. And the same with Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey from 1992. States can require informed consent, parental consent, and 24-hour waiting periods before a woman can have an abortion. It still upheld Roe versus Wade, but allowed states to place more restrictions on abortion. So that's taking something that was a national issue and allowed states to allowed states to have more power in regulating abortion. Also, U.S. versus Lopez, Congress had made a law that declared gun-free school zones, no guns within 1,000 feet of public schools, but the Supreme Court said Congress cannot make that law. It's a state authority, so that's taking national power away and giving it to the states. And then U.S. versus Morrison is a case from Virginia Tech. Portions of the Violence Against Women Act were found to be unconstitutional. Congress does not have the authority to offer federal remedies to victims of gender-motivated violence. That is a state issue, the Supreme Court said. But there is one counterexample to that, and that's Bush versus Gore, which you wouldn't think of as a conservative decision from a court. In the year 2000, with the presidential election hanging on the results of the Florida recount, the Supreme Court stayed a ruling from the Florida Supreme Court ordering a manual recount of the ballots. So the Supreme Court essentially said that a manual recount had to stop. It used a federal law to justify a decision in a state issue. So in this case, a conservative court, which would typically like to give more power to the states, superseded state power by using a national law, a federal law. So for a lot of pundits who watch the Supreme Court, Bush versus Gore was not a decision that that you would expect from a typically conservative court. All right, that's the end of our look at federalism. Hope that helps, and good luck studying.